thought moving out would be about late rent payments and doing my own laundry, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened in that quiet suburban house. The memories still wake me up at night, drenched in cold sweat, and I know I'll never forget the sound of that boy's swing creaking in the darkness or the way his eyes looked when he finally turned to face me. This is what really happened during my first week of living alone, and I swear every word of it is true. The house was perfect when I first saw it, a simple ranch-style home with 2 bedrooms, sitting right in the heart of what seemed like the ideal neighborhood. The real estate agent had walked me through each room, pointing out the hardwood floors and the spacious kitchen, but what really sold me was the backyard. It stretched out behind the house like a blank canvas, surrounded by a wooden fence and overlooked by a raised deck that made me feel like the king of my own little kingdom. I could already picture the parties I would throw, the friends laughing around a fire pit, the girls impressed by my first real place away from my parents. Standing on that deck for the first time, breathing in the warm summer air, I felt like I had finally made it to adulthood. The moving day came and went in a blur of cardboard boxes and tired muscles. My friends helped me haul everything from my old bedroom at my parents' house to this new sanctuary, and by evening we had managed to set up most of the furniture and get the television working. The excitement was building in my chest like electricity as I sent out texts to everyone I knew, telling them to get ready for a housewarming party that very night. This was going to be my grand entrance into independent living, and I wanted it to be memorable. It was during one of our breaks from unpacking that I first noticed him. I had stepped out onto the deck to get some fresh air and survey my new domain when my eyes wandered to the neighboring yards. To my right, I could see a well-maintained garden with a grill and a hammock, clearly belonging to some middle-aged couple who hopefully wouldn't be too bothered by loud music. But when I turned my head to look at the house on my left, that's when I saw something that made me pause. Under a large oak tree decorated with colorful Christmas lights, which seemed odd for the middle of summer, there was a swing set, and on it sat a small figure swaying back and forth in a slow, steady rhythm. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old, and even from my elevated position on the deck, I could see that he was wearing clothes that seemed completely wrong for the weather. A thick hoodie covered his upper body, and his hands were hidden inside what looked like winter gloves, despite the fact that it was easily 80 degrees outside and the sun was beating down mercilessly. I watched him for a few minutes, expecting him to get up and run inside for water or take off some of his layers, but he just kept swinging with his back turned toward me, never changing his pace or position. Something about the sight bothered me in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on, but I pushed the feeling aside and chalked it up to a kid who might be sick or maybe just a little different from others his age. My friend Dan came out to join me as I was still staring at the boy, and he followed my gaze with curiosity. "Have you met your neighbors yet?" he asked with a grin that suggested he was hoping for attractive female neighbors who might come by asking to borrow sugar. When I pointed out the boy on the swing and mentioned that I hadn't seen him move in over an hour, Dan barely glanced over before shrugging and muttering something about the kid probably being special needs. His dismissive attitude should have made me forget about it, but something kept drawing my attention back to that motionless figure swaying gently under the twinkling lights of the oak tree. The party that night was everything I had hoped it would be and more. Friends and cousins arrived with bottles and cases of beer, and soon my backyard was filled with laughter, music, and the kind of carefree energy that only comes from being young and celebrating a milestone. We stayed outside until the early hours of the morning, when a light drizzle started to fall and the temperature dropped just enough to send the girls running inside, complaining about their hair getting frizzy. The guys followed them, of course, holding makeshift umbrellas over their heads and trying to play the hero, which made me laugh at how predictable we all were. I decided to clean up some of the empty bottles and cans before heading inside myself, wanting to be a responsible homeowner even in my slightly drunk state. It was as I was bending down to collect the trash that I happened to glance over at the neighbor's yard again, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The boy was still there. Still swinging. Still wearing that same hoodie and those same gloves. Still moving back and forth in that same mechanical rhythm as if he had never stopped, not even for a moment, during the entire 6 or 7 hours that our party had been raging just a few feet away from him. I was standing there trying to process what I was seeing when a voice behind me nearly made me jump out of my skin. "Hi there, neighbor," came the cheerful greeting, and I spun around so fast that I dropped all the bottles I had been carrying, sending them clattering across the deck. Standing there in pajamas and slippers was an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, holding out his hand for me to shake. My heart was still pounding from being startled, but I managed to introduce myself as Peter and apologize for the loud party. The man told me his name was Paul, and he was surprisingly understanding about the noise, explaining that he and his wife were light sleepers but asking politely if we could keep it down a bit for the rest of the evening. I was immediately struck by how nice he was being about the whole situation. I had expected angry demands and threats to call the police, but instead I was getting friendly conversation and reasonable requests. As we talked, I found myself relaxing and feeling grateful to have such considerate neighbors. It was Paul who brought up the boy on the swing, noticing where my eyes kept drifting despite my efforts to focus on our conversation. "I assume you've noticed the Langer kid by now," he said, cupping his hands and breathing into them to warm them up against the cool night air. When I asked what the deal was with the boy, Paul's expression grew more serious, and he told me that nobody in the neighborhood really knew much about the family's situation. "He just swings and swings until eventually..." Paul's words trailed off, and his eyes widened as he pointed toward the boy. "Wait, it's happening. Check it out." What I witnessed next will haunt me for the rest of my life. The boy had stopped swinging and was sitting perfectly still on the rubber seat, as motionless as a statue. Then, without any warning, he began to shake violently, his small body convulsing as if he were having some kind of seizure. He fell forward off the swing and landed hard on his knees in the dirt, and even from where Paul and I were standing, we could hear the horrible sounds coming from his throat, quick bursts of shrieking mixed with a wet gurgling noise that made my stomach turn. My first instinct was to run over and help him, thinking he was having an asthma attack or some kind of medical emergency, but before I could take more than a couple of steps, the boy's mother came rushing out of the house. The sight of her stopped me in my tracks and sobered me up completely. She was one of the most pitiful-looking human beings I had ever seen, painfully thin with stringy gray hair hanging around her face like cobwebs, her skin so pale it was almost translucent, and dark circles under her eyes that made her look like she hadn't slept in months. In her bony hand, she clutched a small orange prescription bottle, the kind you get from a pharmacy. Mrs. Langer, as I would later learn her name, knelt down beside her convulsing son and poured several white pills into her palm. But before she could even offer them to him properly, the boy grabbed her arm with surprising force and buried his face into her hand, inhaling the pills like a starving animal devouring food. The violence of his action made his mother wince and pull her arm away, and I could see her rubbing her wrist where his grip had left marks on her already bruised skin. Paul and I watched this entire scene unfold in complete silence, neither of us knowing what to say or do. After the boy had consumed whatever medication his mother had given him, he simply stood up, brushed the dirt off his knees, sat back down on his swing, and resumed his gentle swaying as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Langer picked up the empty pill bottle and hurried back into the house, still clutching her injured wrist and moving with the defeated posture of someone who had been through this routine many times before. "Wow," Paul finally whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "I've seen the boy have episodes before, but never that bad. Whatever condition he has, it seems to be getting worse. Poor kid." When I asked him what exactly was wrong with the boy, Paul could only shrug and admit that nobody in the neighborhood knew the details. "He just swings and swings, and then this happens, and then he goes back to swinging. It's been going on for as long as I can remember. We said our goodbyes after that, both of us clearly shaken by what we had witnessed, and I went back inside to find that my party was winding down naturally. Most of my friends were already making their excuses and heading home, which was fine with me because the strange scene I had just witnessed had killed my mood for celebrating. I spent the rest of the night lying in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the image of that boy's violent convulsions or the desperate way he had grabbed those pills from his mother's hand. The next morning hit me like a freight train of regret and nausea. My head felt like it was being split open with an axe. My mouth was so dry I could barely swallow, and my stomach was churning with the kind of sickness that comes from drinking too much cheap beer on an empty stomach. I stumbled to the bathroom just in time to empty what little contents my stomach still held, and then spent the next several hours lying on my couch in a semi-vegetative state, switching between a zombie television show and fitful attempts at sleep. It was afternoon when I finally dragged myself to the kitchen to heat up a frozen dinner, and while I was waiting for the microwave to finish, I remembered that I had ignored the mail delivery earlier in the day. Still feeling queasy and sorry for myself, I shuffled to the front door and scooped up the pile of envelopes and advertisements from my mailbox. Most of it was the usual junk: credit card offers, local restaurant coupons, utility bills, but there was also a small package that I didn't remember ordering. The package was plain brown cardboard with no return address, and when I opened it, I found inside a small orange prescription bottle identical to the one I had seen Mrs. Langer holding the night before. At first, I was confused, thinking maybe it was some kind of strange coincidence, but when I checked the mailing label more carefully, I realized that the package had been delivered to the wrong address. The pills were meant for the Langer family next door, and somehow they had ended up in my mailbox instead. I should have walked over immediately and returned them, but I was still feeling terrible from my hangover, and the thought of having an awkward conversation with my strange neighbors while I was wearing yesterday's clothes and probably smelling like stale beer was more than I could handle. I glanced out my back window and saw the boy swinging away as usual, looking exactly the same as he had every other time I'd seen him, and I figured that since he had taken plenty of pills the night before, waiting a few more hours to return his medication wouldn't hurt anything. That decision turned out to be one of the biggest mistakes of my life. I fell asleep on the couch again that afternoon, exhausted from my hangover and the stress of moving into a new place, and when I woke up, the sun had already set and my house was dark except for the dim glow of my television screen. But there was something else lighting up the darkness outside my windows, the red and blue flashing lights of emergency vehicles. I could hear voices shouting, radios crackling, and the distinctive beeping sound of a large truck backing up, and when I looked out my front window, I saw that my front yard was filled with neighbors and my street was blocked by an ambulance and several police cars. The scene was like something out of a nightmare, surreal and frightening in a way that made me wonder if I was still dreaming. I threw on a jacket to cover my stained shirt and stumbled outside to join the crowd of people who had gathered to watch whatever was happening at the Langer house. Paul was there among the other neighbors, and when I asked him what was going on, he told me that they weren't sure but something terrible had happened to someone in the family. I could see Mr. Langer standing near the ambulance, talking frantically to one of the paramedics, and like his wife, he looked like a man who had been drained of all life and energy. His tank top hung loose on his skeletal frame, his ribs visible through his pale skin, and he was pacing back and forth while covering his eyes and mumbling to himself in obvious distress. The sight of him made me feel sick with dread, and I had a terrible feeling that whatever had happened was somehow connected to the strange boy and his mysterious condition. My worst fears were confirmed when the front door of the Langer house opened and two police officers emerged, followed by a paramedic wheeling out a gurney. On top of the gurney was the broken body of Mrs. Langer, covered in blood and looking more dead than alive. Her pale, bruised wrists hung over the sides of the gurney, blood still dripping from her fingertips onto the pavement below, and her head was lolling back and forth as the paramedic pressed an oxygen mask to her face and rushed her toward the waiting ambulance. The crowd around me erupted into screams and gasps of horror, and I felt my own knees go weak at the sight of so much blood and violence. One of the police officers approached our group and ordered us to disperse and return to our homes, but everyone started bombarding him with questions about what had happened and whether we were safe. The officer's answer was clearly a lie. He claimed that a pack of coyotes had attacked Mrs. Langer in her backyard and that they had already located and killed the animals responsible. I knew he was lying because I had seen enough crime shows to know that coyote attacks don't leave that kind of damage, and besides, there hadn't been any reports of aggressive wildlife in our suburban neighborhood. When I asked about the boy and whether he had been hurt, the officer became visibly irritated and claimed that the child had run away during the attack and that they were still looking for him. He told us to call 911 immediately if we saw the boy anywhere, and then he practically ran back to his police car as if he couldn't wait to get away from our questions. As the crowd slowly broke up and people returned to their houses, I found myself standing alone in my front yard, staring at the blood-stained driveway where the ambulance had been parked. A terrible thought was growing in my mind like a poisonous seed. What if this was somehow my fault? What if Mrs. Langer had been attacked because I had failed to return her son's medication when it was delivered to my house by mistake? The rational part of my brain tried to dismiss these paranoid thoughts, but the guilt was eating away at me like acid. I went back inside and tried to convince myself that I was being ridiculous, that there was no way a misdelivered package of pills could have led to such violence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to get rid of the evidence. I decided that I would sneak over to the Langer house under cover of darkness and put the pill bottle in their mailbox anonymously. That way no one would ever know that I had failed to return them when I should have. I grabbed the orange bottle from where I had left it on my couch and walked toward my back door, planning to cut through the yards to avoid being seen from the street. But when I looked out my back window, the sight that greeted me made my heart stop beating for several seconds. The oak tree with its cheerful Christmas lights was still illuminated, but now instead of casting a warm glow over a child's playground, the lights were revealing a crime scene of unimaginable horror. The ground beneath the swing set was soaked with blood, and scattered across the dirt were pieces of torn clothing and what looked like chunks of flesh. Among the carnage, I could clearly see the boy's distinctive hoodie and gloves, both of them shredded and stained with blood. My vision started to blur with tears as the full reality of what I was seeing hit me like a physical blow. The boy was dead. The strange, sick child who had spent his days swinging under that tree was gone, probably torn apart by whatever had attacked his mother, and I had been too selfish and lazy to return his medication when he might have needed it most. I slammed my fist against the windowsill in frustration and grief, and the sound echoed through my house like a gunshot. The sudden noise made the silence that followed seem even more oppressive and frightening. And it was in that silence that I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up in terror. From somewhere in the direction of my bedroom came a low, wet gurgling sound, like someone drowning in their own blood. I froze completely, every muscle in my body locked in place by pure instinctual fear. I held my breath and listened with every fiber of my being, praying that I had imagined the sound or that it was just the house settling or the television making noise. But then I heard it again, louder this time and definitely coming from the hallway that led to my bedroom, a disgusting, inhuman gurgle that sounded like death itself. My house was still dark except for the weak light from my television, and suddenly that darkness felt like a living thing pressing in on me from all sides. My mind was screaming at me to move, to run, to get out of the house immediately, but my body seemed to have forgotten how to obey my commands. I managed to pull out my phone with shaking hands and fumble for the flashlight app, thinking that if I could just see what was making that horrible noise, I might be able to figure out what to do about it. As I was struggling with my phone, trying to activate the flashlight while my hands trembled like leaves in a hurricane, I saw movement in the hallway, Something small and dark was crawling along the floor on all fours, moving in a way that looked almost human but wrong, like a person who had forgotten how to walk properly. The thing's head was down close to the floor, and I could hear that terrible gurgling sound coming from it as it seemed to be sniffing the ground like an animal following a scent trail. Finally, my phone's flashlight came on, and the bright beam cut through the darkness to illuminate the creature that had invaded my home. What I saw in that moment of horrible clarity will stay with me until the day I die, burned into my memory like a brand. It was the Langer boy, but not as I had ever seen him before. Without his concealing layers of clothing, I could see his true condition, and it was far worse than anything I could have imagined. His skin was like old leather, covered in scars and lesions that looked like they had never properly healed. His body was twisted and deformed in ways that seemed to defy human anatomy, and when he slowly raised his head to look at the source of the light, I saw eyes that belonged in a nightmare rather than in the face of a child. The darkness around his pupils was so complete that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the color of his irises was unlike anything I had ever seen in nature, a sickly yellow-green that seemed to glow with its own malevolent energy. We stared at each other across the length of my living room, predator and prey frozen in a moment of mutual recognition. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think clearly as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. This thing that looked like a child but moved like a wild animal, this creature that should have been dead in the backyard with its torn clothing, was somehow here in my house, and I had no idea how it had gotten in or what it wanted from me. The boy, if I could still call him that, slowly turned his body to face me directly and began to crawl closer on his hands and knees, leaving bloody handprints on my hardwood floor with each step. The sound of his approach was like fingernails on a chalkboard, wet and scraping and absolutely revolting. He moved with deliberate slowness, as if he was savoring my terror, and with each inch he covered, I felt my sanity slipping further away. When he was close enough that I could smell the death and decay radiating from his body, the boy rose to his feet and stood before me like a grotesque parody of a normal child. His arms hung at his sides like broken tree branches, and his head tilted at an unnatural angle as he studied my face with those horrible, glowing eyes. I felt like I was drowning in fear, like the air in my lungs had turned to concrete and my heart was going to explode from the strain of pure terror. It was then that his gaze shifted from my eyes to my hand, the hand that was still clutching the orange bottle of pills. The moment he saw what I was holding, his entire demeanor changed from predatory patience to desperate hunger. His mouth opened in a silent scream that revealed rows of teeth that had been filed down to sharp points, each one stained with what I could only assume was his mother's blood. The sound that came out of his throat was like the cry of a banshee, inhuman and filled with such anguish and rage that it seemed to bypass my ears and attack my soul directly. The scream broke the spell of paralysis that had held me captive, and I fell backward onto the floor, still clutching the pill bottle and staring up at the boy who now loomed over me like a nightmare made flesh. He crouched down so that his face was level with mine, and I could see small pieces of torn flesh still stuck between his razor-sharp teeth. His breath smelled like rotting meat and chemical medicine, and when he reached out one blood-stained hand toward me, I knew exactly what he wanted. "You want your pills, right?" I managed to whisper through lips that felt numb with terror. The boy didn't answer with words, but his eyes never left the bottle in my hand, and his expression of desperate hunger told me everything I needed to know. With shaking fingers, I managed to open a small orange container and pour several white pills into my palm, holding them out to him like an offering to some ancient and terrible god. The boy's mouth closed, and for a moment his face almost looked human again, even managing something that might have been a smile. He took the pills from my hand with surprising gentleness, tilted his head back, and swallowed them all at once with an audible gulp that sounded like a stone dropping into a deep well. Then, without another sound, he turned and walked toward my back door, pausing only to look back at me one final time with those glowing eyes before pushing the door open and disappearing into the night. I watched through my window as he made his way back to his swing set, stepping carefully around the bloody remains of the crime scene, and sat down on the rubber seat as if nothing unusual had happened. Within moments, he was swaying back and forth in that same mechanical rhythm I had observed so many times before, looking for all the world like a normal child enjoying a peaceful evening in his backyard. I managed to close and lock my back door before my legs gave out completely, and I collapsed to the floor in a heap of trembling limbs and racing thoughts. My mind kept trying to rationalize what I had just experienced, to find some logical explanation for how a dead boy had come back to life and invaded my home in search of his medication, but there was no rational framework that could contain what I had witnessed. That was a week ago, and I've been living in this house ever since, trapped by my lease and my terror in equal measure. Mrs. Langer survived her injuries and is still in the hospital, though the doctors say she may never fully recover from the trauma. Mr. Langer has taken over the responsibility of feeding his son the mysterious pills whenever the boy's condition requires it, and I've watched through my windows as he performs this ritual with the same defeated resignation his wife had shown. The police never questioned me about the events of that night, and I never volunteered any information about what I had seen or experienced. How could I possibly explain that the missing boy had never really been missing at all, that he had somehow survived being torn apart and had come to my house looking for the medication I had failed to deliver? Who would believe such an impossible story, and what good would it do to tell it? I've been making plans to move out as soon as my lease allows, probably to an apartment in the city where there are no backyards or swing sets or mysterious neighbors with impossible children. The nightmares from that night have made sleep almost impossible, and I've left my backyard exactly as messy as it was after the housewarming party because I'm too afraid to go outside and clean it up. Every time I even glance toward my back window, I see the boy sitting on his swing, but now he always faces my house instead of turning away, and his eyes follow my movements with the patience of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. 3 nights ago, I watched Mr. Langer come outside to give his son what appeared to be the last pills from his final bottle of medication. Since then, the swing has been empty, and I know that it's only a matter of time before the boy's condition flares up again and he comes looking for relief. I've been checking my mailbox obsessively, hoping against hope that another misdelivered package might give me something to bargain with, but so far there's been nothing. As I write this, I'm looking out my window at that empty swing, and I can't shake the feeling that somewhere in the darkness, those glowing eyes are watching me, waiting for the hunger to become too strong to ignore. I don't know what will happen when the boy runs out of medication completely, and I don't think I want to find out. All I know is that I made a terrible mistake when I failed to return those pills, and now I'm going to spend the rest of my life paying for that moment of selfish laziness. The swing is still empty, but I can feel him out there in the darkness, and I know that sooner or later, he's going to come knocking on my door again. And this time, I won't have anything to give him except my own terror and regret.